saw a vision with my eyes open.
A long time ago, not too far from our world today, a little girl was born in a small village in Germany. Her name was Hildegard. She was 10 years old, just a child, but there was something in her eyes that looked far beyond the walls around her. In the Middle Ages, women didn't speak, especially not little girls. Your job was to be silent, not to learn, certainly not to teach. But Hildegard was different. No one had ever handed her a pen, but when she looked at the walls, she saw words. When she listened to the wind, she heard melodies. And most of all, she didn't see with her eyes. She saw with her heart. It began when she was still a child. She started seeing things no one else could. Not monsters, not madness, but a soft light, a glowing vision, a sense of knowing. One day, she told her mother,
"Mother, God showed me something."
Her mother said nothing. She looked at Hildegard's eyes and sent her to a monastery. At the age of 8, Hildegard was enclosed in the monastery at Disibodenberg. Yes, enclosed, because it wasn't a school. Food was scarce. The cold wasn't just in the air, it crept into your bones. And no one was allowed outside. It was a world made of stone, silence, and shadows. But inside Hildegard, something was alive. Girls here grew up to be silent, obedient, and invisible. They were devoted to God and cut off from the world. But even in there, Hildegard kept asking questions. She spoke to plants. She studied the wild herbs that grew between the stones. She learned which leaf healed which wound, with no teacher but nature itself. Her curiosity could not be contained by walls. She stayed silent for 30 years. She wrote nothing. She said nothing. She only prayed, only watched, but she never looked away. In a world where women were forbidden to speak, she listened. In a world that asked for obedience, she observed, not out of fear, but because she was waiting. And one day, the silence grew too loud, and Hildegard spoke.
I see the light of God. These visions are not mine. They are shown to me, and I must write them.
She was afraid, but she wrote, because not writing felt like betrayal to the visions, to her voice, to something greater than herself. Hildegard sat at a desk once reserved only for men, and began writing Scivias. It wasn't just a book, it was a voice, a soul unfolding itself on parchment, a woman raised among silence, finally speaking her truth. And what happened? Men listened, clergy listened, even the Pope listened. Because what she wrote was not just about faith, it was about nature, the human soul, and the quiet wisdom of being a woman. Today, people call her a mystic, but Hildegard was also a scientist. She observed the plants around her, noted their healing properties, wrote about women's health, prescribed remedies from nature. Her works Physica and Causae et Curae laid the groundwork for medicine in the 1100s. And here's something most people don't know. The first known person to document skin diseases in medical detail was Hildegard. Not a Renaissance man, not a university scholar, but a woman, cloistered and unseen, putting into words what others didn't even dare to name. And yes, she did all this while being a woman. Each remedy she recorded wasn't just for the body, it was for dignity, for agency, for the quiet suffering no one saw. She didn't just want to write, she wanted to heal. Her knowledge wasn't just intellectual, it was compassionate. Oh, and here's a fun twist. She also wrote the first known description of hops, the plant used in beer, and recognized its preservative power. So next time you see a cold pint of beer, you might want to thank a 12th century nun. Then came the music, the hymns she wrote, the melodies she composed, still echo in churches 1,000 years later. Her words were simple, but her voice belonged to the sky. To Hildegard, the soul speaks its purest truth through music, and just as she saw with her heart, she made others feel with her voice. And did you know? She didn't just compose music, she wrote the first known morality play in history, Ordo Virtutum. It was performed entirely by women. While the world silenced them, she gave them roles, songs, and voices. Now stop and think. It's the 12th century. You're a woman, a nun, and you write to the Pope. Yes, Hildegard did that. She stood up for what she believed in. She challenged the silence placed on women, and in her letters to the highest religious authority, she wrote, "Women too hear the voice of God, and that voice must be written, heard, and known." Hildegard never called herself a feminist. That word didn't exist. But everything she did reminded the world that women are thinking beings, feeling beings, seeing beings. With her pen, her prayers, and her fierce clarity, she opened a path. A little girl once saw a light. She heard a whisper. She stayed silent. Then she spoke, and the world began to change. At Rupertsberg Monastery, the morning prayer hour was quiet, but now there was another sound echoing through the walls. Hildegard's voice. She was no longer just praying, she was writing, speaking, teaching, sharing the visions she had once kept hidden, and that unsettled many. One day, the elder abbess pulled her aside.
"Hildegard, you are going too far. Women do not teach. Women do not speak. You are overstepping."
But Hildegard looked her in the eyes and replied, "I am not speaking for myself. I am speaking the truth I was shown." That sentence changed everything. The pressure around her didn't make her retreat, it made her grow. Hildegard made a bold decision. She would build her own monastery, one led by women, independent from male authority, a place where women could learn, heal, and create freely. But in her time, this was nearly impossible. All land belonged to male-controlled church orders. Only men were permitted to lead communities. A woman asking for such autonomy? Unthinkable. Still, Hildegard wrote letters, 1, then 10, then dozens, to bishops, to nobles, even to the Pope, and finally, permission was granted. The Rupertsberg Monastery was born. Hildegard now led her own sacred space, but this didn't mean she was left alone. In fact, resistance grew. The idea of women living independently, studying, writing, treating the sick was threatening. Some clergy found her writings too bold. Others insisted,
God does not speak to women.
Some even accused her of heresy, but Hildegard did not stop. Even as opposition rose around her, she kept writing, teaching, building. But just as she was finding her strength in the world, she suffered a loss that shook her more deeply than any public trial. Richardis von Stade, Hildegard's closest companion, spiritual sister, and collaborator, was assigned to lead a distant monastery. Richardis had helped shape Hildegard's first great work, Scivias, and the bond between them was more than intellectual, it was deeply emotional. Hildegard fought to keep her near. She wrote to bishops, abbots, even the Pope, pleading, "This cannot be God's will. Her soul is bound to mine." But her pleas were ignored. Richardis left. Within a year, she died. And Hildegard, heartbroken, wrote in one of her last letters to her, "I loved her with a divine love." This loss pierced her deeper than any public attack. It was a grief that never left her, and yet even that sorrow became a part of her voice. From that silence, she built something even louder, a place where women could live fully. And then she did something almost no woman of her time dared. She took her voice on the road. Hildegard began preaching publicly, in cathedrals, marketplaces, and courts, cities like Cologne, Mainz, and Trier, and people came not to stare at a woman speaking, but to listen. Not because she was loud, but because she was clear. Her words didn't chase power, they carried truth. In her monastery, the women weren't just praying, they were learning, writing, growing herbs, composing music. It was like a hidden university for women. At a time when most men couldn't even read, Hildegard was teaching women about medicine and theology. This place wasn't just a monastery, it was a revolution in stone, and the outside world felt that. One day, a young soldier came to the monastery, weak and dying. He had once fought against the church. Now he sought peace. Hildegard took him in, tried to heal him, but he died in her care, and she buried him on sacred ground. The church was furious. They ordered her to dig him up. She refused. So the Pope imposed a punishment. Her monastery was silenced. No mass, no music, no sacred rites. It was meant to break her spirit. But Hildegard did not give in. She was nearly 80 years old, and she wrote a letter stronger than any sermon. If a soul turns to God, do not see the past, see the heart. I chose mercy, you chose punishment. And the Pope lifted the ban. Hildegard was weary, her body was failing, but her light had never burned brighter. Everything Hildegard did, every step she took, said one thing: being a woman is not a weakness. Seeing deeply is not madness. And a voice, if it speaks the truth, cannot be silenced. In her final years, the quiet power of a woman Hildegard was old now. Her hair was white, her hands trembled with time, but her eyes still carried the light from that very first vision. The Rupertsberg Monastery was no longer just a building of stone. It had become a beacon, a place where women didn't just pray, but understood, healed, and created. And Hildegard kept writing. Her desire to share never faded, because she knew knowledge left unshared remains incomplete. She wasn't just a healer of bodies, she healed silences the kind that linger for generations. Not all wounds are visible. Some are passed from mother to daughter in silence. In a time when women weren't even allowed to speak about their own bodies, Hildegard wrote openly about female sexuality, not to scandalize, but to give language to what had long been locked away. Even in her last years, Hildegard wrote endlessly, to kings, to bishops, to the sick, to women. Her letters were never full of anger, but they carried force. They weren't written to shout, they were written to move, and they did, across time, kings, walls, centuries. And they all echoed one message: do not let anyone extinguish your light. In the Middle Ages, women didn't speak. She wrote in silence. She prayed in solitude. She observed without turning away. But what she wrote is still read today. In medical schools, in music conservatories, in histories of women's resistance. Because Hildegard was not just a nun. She was a visionary, a scientist, a composer, a leader. She was criticized for studying science, but never gave up. She was judged for educating women, but could not be silenced. She was punished for showing compassion, but refused to step back. So, if you believe in something, truly believe, don't whisper, don't wait for permission. Stand for it, speak for it, live by it. Some are born behind stone walls, but no wall can contain a voice that carries truth. Hildegard saw with her heart, and when the time came, she spoke, even when it was forbidden, even when it was dangerous, even when it meant standing alone. And because she spoke, the world listened, then and now.